Welcome everybody to the November session of our Land and Wildlife Speaker Series. I'm the Wildlife Management Specialist for University of Maryland Extension. I do a lot of work on bobwhite quail, deer management, and human dimensions of wildlife. I'm increasingly doing a lot more work on forest management and the importance of forests for our various wildlife species. Today's speaker, I'm really excited to have a colleague and friend, Dan Small. He's the Associate Director of Natural Land Stewardship at Washington College. He helps manage the River and Field campus, where they do a lot of prescribed burning and wildlife habitat, especially grassland habitat improvement work. He got his bachelor's degree at Bridgewater State University and recently got a master's in restoration ecology from Colorado State. He's published over 12 peer-reviewed papers I saw on your website, all about different aspects of birds. If you want to learn more, you can dive into some of those papers. They're up on his bio on his website. He runs a significant grant-funded project where he helps put in habitat across the landscape. So if you have land and you want to put it in into habitat, talk to Dan afterwards. He's going to be sharing more about that at the end.
Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Happy to talk and excited to talk about our efforts with the Natural Lands Project. And I'm just here, the one presenting today. And I do want to give Kathy Thornton, who Luke had mentioned has joined us today online as well, as a integral part of our project, along with many different organizations that we partner with that I have a slide showing some of those a little bit later. But yeah, talking about Natural Lands Project and our efforts to help northern bobwhite support their populations through habitat management, creating new habitat, and then obviously doing some management over time to keep that habitat in good condition. And so before we dive into overall quail habitat specifically, I just wanted to kind of lay the context of why we are doing what we're doing with the Natural Lands Project and how many other people are doing things focused on grassland birds in general. So this is a graph from the North American Bird Conservation Initiative showing 50 years of data. So it's multiple data sets all compiled into one graph showing population trends over time. As you can see, geese and swans, dabbling ducks, and water birds are doing really well across North America. And then there's a whole other suite of other species that are not doing very well, including our eastern forest birds. And then more relevant to this talk today is grassland birds. So across the range, 50 years of data, grassland birds have declined by 34%. So they're the largest ones declining, and it's increasing each year. Zooming closer to Maryland, here in Maryland, and I just want to talk about several different groups of species that use what we'll define broadly as early successional habitat, and that can include native warm season grasses and wildflowers. I'll group in working farms like hay and pasture lands, and as well as old fields where management maybe hasn't taken place for 5 to 10 years. It's grown up past sort of a dominated field by grasses, and it's more shrubby scrub. And so what we're looking at here is breeding bird survey data. So this is sort of the most robust data set to looking at breeding grassland birds, so summertime calling males, started in 1966, and the black bar is showing average number of males heard on those routes here, specifically in Maryland. So quail declining by 9.7% annually. Field sparrows, grasshopper sparrows also showing declines, and these are the species that do prefer this kind of native warm season grass habitat and wildflowers, but they do use some other grasses as well. Dick thistles, on the other hand, are doing well. So they didn't really show up in Maryland in any kind of larger numbers until 2005 or so. They're still very low population, but they're finding enough habitat to at least have a number of males calling on these routes. For working grasslands, these are the pasture and hay fields. These most of these species, and these aren't just restricted to these species, but these are pretty representative of what you might find in those habitats. They're declining as well, with the exception of bobolink. And so bobolink seem to be doing okay in these habitats, at least the calling males. Some of these birds are long distance migrants like Henslow sparrows or bobolinks, so some of the wintering habitat may be affecting their populations as well. Shrub scrub, so this is the habitat now that is kind of beyond just grasses and wildflowers and gone into kind of young shrub, young forested areas. And these groups, these species here, like that kind of habitat. And with the exception of blue grosbeak, most of these species using this kind of habitat are showing extensive declines. So as a group of grassland wildlife, species that depend on early successional wildlife habitat, they're showing declines mostly across the range. So here for bobwhite, this is the same data set, but instead of showing the average number of males declining over time, this is the total number of male quail herd from one summer to the next. And so these are routes spread across Maryland that are repeated every year. And that gives you a snapshot of how populations are doing across time. And so in this case, when the survey started in 1966, there was close to 2,500 male quail calling across Maryland. So obviously this isn't every single male across the state. This is just where these particular routes were run. You repeat these routes every year, and fast forward to 2017, and there's less than 50 male quail calling across those same routes. So pretty dramatic decline. I think it's important to note that these declines were ongoing prior to the 1966 start of these systematic surveys across the state. So quail, I think, have been in decline for quite some time prior to these surveys, but this is the best data set we have and the longest term data set to show how birds are doing. So why are all these birds declining? I'm sure you're asking yourselves, and it all comes down to habitat. Habitat change and habitat loss is sort of the driving factors of why these populations are declining. But it's kind of one of those situations where it's death by a thousand cuts, where habitat is the key, but there's lots of other things that are happening on the landscape that do make changes and affect populations of birds. So deer, you may be wondering why deer population increases may be affecting quail. And I should say this is just kind of a hypothetical chart showing how things have changed over time. Obviously, there's no data behind these. It's just these are changes on the landscape that have happened. So deer have increased since the 50s. They browse heavy. So understories of forest are often denuded of vegetation. Out in the open, if you do have meadows, a lot of times they're heavily grazing some of those flowering plants. Oftentimes this manipulates the makeup of the habitat and shifts it towards more invasive species, where they may not eat those invasive species because they're focused on the native species. As you might imagine, human populations have increased substantially over time, and urbanization and planting of houses has increased. Mammalian predators, a significant impact on quail populations. Their numbers have increased a lot. So as we change the landscape as humans, certain species like raccoons, possums, skunks, red foxes increase because they can adapt to the landscape that we're changing. Avian predators have increased significantly as well. This is a major conservation success story. And instead of biologists counting raptors migrating past hawk watch sites like Hawk Mountain in Pennsylvania, back in the early days, they used to shoot them as for fun. So we don't do that anymore. Populations have increased. Certain species like Cooper's hawks or red-shouldered hawks and barred owls that do prey upon quail in significant numbers, they have been able to adapt to how we've changed the landscape as well. So we're kind of shifting the balance to some of these bigger predators that take a lot of wildlife in favor of them over other things as the habitat decreases. So focusing on how the farm landscape has changed, The use of pesticides increased. So now we have kind of monocultures of corn, soybean, and wheat, and kind of going edge to edge. And fertilizer has increased as well. So now yields have increased. As yields increase, the farm fields increases. So inversely, then hedgerows decrease. Hedgerows are a critical component on the landscape, providing shelter for wildlife, escape cover, and thermal refuge. They have declined as farm fields increase. And then Conservation Reserve Program. That's the CRP, a major conservation program throughout the United States. But not all CRP land is created equal or managed equally. So, for example, non-native cool season grasses are not that beneficial to quail and most other grassland birds. And then management of those lands also is critical in shaping how populations respond to that habitat. So these are kind of the bigger picture things that are affecting the landscape and quail populations. So what does that actually look like on the landscape? So I'm going to focus on a small sort of 10-mile square area in Queen Anne's County on the upper shore of Maryland, sort of basically that upper left-hand corner of the screen here. And so we're going to start in 1937, imagery from 1937 showing a really diverse farming landscape. So all those different shades of gray are different farm fields at different stages of growth, different crops. Some are no doubt fallow when fallow field rotation was still really in abundance. And then if you're zooming in a little bit closer, depending on the resolution of your computer screens, you can see between all of these farm fields, or at least most of these farm fields, are these dark linear strips, which are hedgerows or overgrown fence rows. So in amongst the different diverse farming landscape, you have hedgerows that provide that escape and cover or singing perches for certain species and things like that. We're going to take a big jump here and look at 1964 imagery. And so you can kind of see some changes that are starting to happen. Some of those farm fields are getting larger. Some of those grays are all kind of fading into similar colors. Some development has started to come in. But there are a few fields that are still showing diverse, different plantings, and I do see some hedgerows still scattered throughout. And fast forward to 1978, and sort of this change is sort of completed, right? So now we have almost like this single shade of light gray across the farming landscape, huge fields. The development on the lower left is completed, and essentially what it looks like in 1978 is similar to what it looks like now, at least in this 10 by 10 mile square area. The major changes that we're seeing now here are pivot irrigation. So some of those fields are getting irrigated. And the major thing that really sticks out to me is in the northern portion of the image there are what doesn't look like crop fields. Those are native grasses that I'm going to talk a little bit more about. But a little more subtle changes on this image here is some areas have been taken out of production and left fallow. We have buffers surrounding all the farm field edges. So it's a little bit hard to see at this scale, but there's a lot of new habitat on this slide compared to 1978. And that is all a result of the Conservation Reserve Program. So just to remember, this is a small 10 by 10 mile area in northern Queen Anne's County. If you sort of just think about this as a larger landscape change across Maryland's eastern shore, you can understand how these changes on the landscape, coupled with predator pressure and things like that, how grassland birds, and particularly quail, have really started to decline. Habitat look like in today's modern farming landscape that can support grassland birds, grassland wildlife, pollinators, etc. So what does, and I think we're doing a really good job here at Washington College's River and Field campus, where Kathy and I and a few other people help manage a large 200-acre grassland. So this is a drone shot looking north into Kent County with the Chester River in between, just showing a summertime shot of a native warm season grasses. And you can kind of see some yellow out in there, even at this scale. So it's pretty diverse. This is a late winter shot. We're just starting our prescribed burn rotation out here during when this was taken. And you can kind of see the way things are shaping up here. We have these blocks of habitat that we manage on a rotational basis. And then within each of the blocks, for example, the field just to the right of where we burned, within that field, there's a mosaic of habitat types. And so what we're looking for to support quail on within these habitats is a mix of flowering or forb areas that we consider or is considered brood habitat. So areas where there's not a lot of vegetation on the ground, but there's a 3 to 4 foot canopy of wildflowers that is not only producing food in terms of seed and attracting insects, but it's a canopy that birds can move under with relative ease and safety. Next to that are grasses, native warm season clump forming grasses that birds are nesting in. And so the burning, the rotation of burning and some other management techniques like disking and herbicide applications can create these pockets of habitat in a larger field complex that birds can then nest in, move their broods to, and then in amongst that, you're also looking to create islands of cover, escape cover, or hedgerows. And so we don't have enough hedgerows or islands of cover out here, and I'll get into that in a little bit. Another photo showing sort of that diverse mosaic of different grasses at different stages. So the greener areas are new growth in springtime, where the brown areas are areas from previous year's growth. And so this mosaic of patchwork really helps grassland birds find where they need. And then for ground nesting wildlife, it's really important for movement to have these different habitat types adjacent to each other. And then kind of just an aerial shot just showing what it looks like a little bit closer to the ground. But even from this height, from the drone, you can kind of see areas of grasses, wildflowers, and then you get a sense that it's probably pretty open underneath all those wildflowers. But I like to follow all that up with just saying that you do not need to have 200 acres in one block of habitat to make a difference for quail. So it's ideally, that's the optimal what you're looking for. And some of the state lands have the ability to take out large blocks of habitat like that. But on a private land scale, it's more feasible to take out smaller chunks of habitat and connect them with other habitats across, whether it's your own farm or your neighbor's property. And so what we have here is areas of habitat spread sort of northeast, south, and west on this farm field. But what we did was create 100-foot strips of habitat connecting those separate habitat types in order to facilitate movement, create these corridors, and create areas of refuge. So when the crop fields get harvested, the standing vegetation in these strips, the two up through the middle going north-south, and if you look carefully on the left-hand side, west-hand side, you can see a habitat strip between the brown crop field and the really vibrant green cover crop. And also up north as well. And so this farm field is about 150 acres, is broken up into sort of these 50 to 60 acre chunks, but with habitat in between them to provide cover and breeding habitat for grassland birds. And birds have really responded here really well. So essentially, habitat can happen on multiple scales depending on the landscape and then also neighbors' interest. So how does that all look when we come to quail, and how are quail doing on this property where we're managing extensive amount of habitat? And so This graph is showing two survey data. One is the covey counts in orange. So that is a survey method done in October each year where researchers will stand in points and quail will call about a half hour before sunrise for about a couple minutes. And they're just making a call. Covey is a group of birds that they spend basically most of the winter with. So usually 10 to 15 individuals will stay together through the winter. Some birds will move between coveys, but essentially they're a group that forage together. More eyes are going to detect predators, and it's this group that calls in the morning from these roosting locations where they sleep overnight. And so they call for about a couple minutes each morning during the fall. And it allows us to get a sense of what the breeding productivity is. So most of the individuals within each covey are birds that were hatched that summer. So higher number of coveys equals greater nesting success. And then the blue are the number of males calling during the summer months. So these are the males doing the typical Bobwhite and attracting females and sort of being slightly territorial. And that gives us a sense of how many birds actually survive the winter. And so if you look at 2009, when DNR first started the surveys out on the property, and I should say we've been monitoring quail on this property for many decades, but each in the early 90s, protocols were slightly different. And so this has been very consistent over the years since 2009. 35 coveys in 2009. In February 2010, we had huge back-to-back snowstorms where it basically dropped the number of males that had survived the winter in that blue bar in 2010 to just less than 5 individual males that we detected on these same survey routes. Fast forward each year until 2018 for the summer calling counts. And because we had habitat in place, continue to manage it, the population rose into the peak calling number of males, 35 in 2018. You can see we matched the number of coveys we were hearing in the fall in 2015 in a shorter period of time. So the motto to this is, if you have habitat in place and manage it, you can support quail populations even when you have really low numbers like we did in 2010. And so that's critical. What's going on with the number of males that we're hearing currently singing during the summertime, you might be asking, and that is because we do not have enough winter cover on the farm. And so that escape cover, that cover from inclement weather, the increase in predators, all takes its toll. And so one way to combat that and reverse that is planting hedgerows, shrub islands. We're doing it with native plants as much as possible, but that takes time to develop that thick cover that can really protect those birds. So we have great breeding success shown by the number of coveys. And in fact, this was the second highest number of coveys heard on the property this year. And it was followed by the lowest number of males heard during the summertime since 2014. Which just goes to show you the value of having lots of nesting habitat, but equally important winter cover. So here comes the Natural Lands Project. And so we really, over the years on the River and Field campus and known locally as Chino Farms, have given endless number of presentations and tours to groups, to individuals about how to manage quail. And it wasn't until 2015 when we received a grant from the Department of Natural Resources to actually have funding to help those landowners make changes on their properties. So in 2016 was our first year we planted habitat. And now you fast forward to 2024, and we've done over 2,000 acres of habitat on both public and private lands. And so this effort really is coming directly out of our efforts and success on the River and Field campus. And we can use that as a model. So just like I said, we may not be able to get people to plant 200 acres of habitat in one block, but the idea is there. If you plant habitat and you manage it, you do the habitat with the right species, so a mix of wildflowers and native grasses, implement hedgerow where you can make a difference for quail, and it's resonated. So of those 2,000 acres, over 1,100 have been on private lands. So that's pretty critical here on the shore, where the majority of the habitat is private, or majority of farms is on private properties. The nice thing about public lands is you can do larger projects. And so we have a mix of state parks and county properties where everyone here take note of where the names of those properties are free to go. Walk around, see what quail habitat looks like. We're seeing and hearing quail at Sassafras and Conquest Preserve as well. So there are quail have shown up on these properties and doing relatively well. Not all of those properties are necessarily planted with meadows. We have done quite a bit of afforestation or new tree planting areas on some of these properties. So in the triangles are public lands, and generally, like I said, those are going to be bigger projects, but private lands are pretty critical in the overall effort needed to make a difference for grassland birds. So obviously, a lot more projects, 80 plus, are on private lands, and we want to see that increase to try and make some of these connections across the landscape. Here on the upper right is what we've been able to do over 5 years at Sassafras Natural Resource Management Area that is managed by the state parks. We've partnered with them, and we've planted 160 acres of grasses and meadows and wildflowers represented with the green color. And then in the orange are these areas where we've planted lots of trees. And so there are competing objectives on some of these properties. And for example, on the state parks, there's a lot of pressure in recent years to plant trees with the 5 million tree initiative. And then there's some limitations on the state parks and their ability to do long-term management. So some of these areas that are skinny in between larger forested blocks just make sense to kind of connect them, create more habitat for the forest interior dwelling species that like larger forested areas, and just focus the meadow areas on these larger blocks of habitat. And that's kind of what we did at Cypress Branch State Park, which is the newest state park on the shore here, just outside of Millington. 70 acres of meadow and about 50 acres of trees were planted over the last 2 years. There are walking trails throughout these properties, so it's a good place to go visit to kind of have a sense of big open grasslands. Here, this is a Conquest Preserve, which is a county-owned property. It's about 800 acres, sorry, with some areas of afforestation, lots of wetlands, and then a mix of grassland types. So there's native grasses with native warm season grasses and wildflowers, and then other areas of cool season grasses. And that idea was to create habitat for a bigger suite of grassland wildlife, like if you remember back to the sort of the working land, meadow larks, savanna sparrows, in the winter, short-eared owls, and northern harriers hunt over these areas as well. This is a great place to visit. It's a little bit of a confusing map. This is on the Maryland Ornithological Society website. And it's really geared towards birders or people visiting the park. So for example, if you find a really cool bird in field 5, you can kind of give other people interested in finding that bird directions to it. But the blue lines are all trails. So it's a great place to go visit if you live locally. Here's just a few photos of what Conquest looks like and the wetlands. You kind of see, this is in the very first year that the wetland was put in and the grasses were planted. The brown grasses are the native grasses, and the green grasses or the green shades are a mix of cool season and clover, which we have begun managing over the years. So these are just winter shots showing the Corsica River in the background there, entering the Chester and the meadows and the wetlands. Here's spring. Quail numbers at this site. We only heard a couple birds in the first few years, and this last year we are hearing 6 to 8 males calling out in the summertime. And I did hear a covey when I was birding this property this past weekend calling. We did some projects that are geared towards more visitors and humans, where this is a native food forest where we've planted native berry nut producing species that we can go forage when they're mature. But like I said, private lands are going to be the key to helping grassland wildlife across the shore. I believe it's over 90% of the land is owned by in private hands. So in order for us to make a difference, a larger difference at least, we have to involve a lot of private properties. And so a lot of our work for the Natural Lands Project is focused on private properties. Here's an example from Queen Anne's County where we kind of talk about what we talk about is an anchor farm approach. So in 2018, we were able to meet with these landowners and plant over 50 acres of habitat, and then over the next successive years, meet up with their neighbors and add habitat in the orange in 2019 and 2020 to kind of build out habitat. So as quail, other wildlife find these properties, they have room to expand. The blue areas are meadows. We are not responsible for planting those, but we are helping to kind of oversee some of the management of those. So as you add habitat to a larger area, wildlife, has these corridors. Connectivity is pretty critical for quail. They do not migrate, they do disperse, but they do disperse very slowly over time. I've just included a bunch of different photos here showing some of the wildlife found on these projects. This is a dickcissel, and then quite a few photos just showing what the habitat looks like from the air and then also from the ground. So like I said, buffer is not only critical for connecting habitat and edges of farms across a larger landscape. In this case, this is critical for water quality improvements. And I think it's really important to note that our funding for all of these projects from DNR and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation all derive from water quality improvements to help the Chesapeake Bay. We're just doing it in a way that appeals to landowners from an aesthetic point of view, lots of wildflowers and diverse habitat plantings, but also connecting with landowners that have this memory of quail across the landscape, and we're connecting with them for this cultural sort of iconic species that has a long heritage on the landscape. And in order to do that, we show them what our success on the River and Field campus and try and use that as a motivator to have them make change. So it's a male quail in a very young bean field, not necessarily good habitat, but I think I caught him by surprise there. And obviously pollinators, they're making the news in many different ways these days because of dramatic declines as well. So adding habitat to support quail has so many different co-benefits that are just too numerous to list. Here again, a long strip, 100-foot wide buffer connecting one field of the farm to another, but then also serving to filter sediment and nutrients from running off the fields. Grasshopper sparrow, one of the species that we showed suffering large population declines. Everyone knows about monarchs, pretty dramatic decline. I think there's talk about potentially listing them on the endangered species list. Projects can vary depending on the landowner's interests and ability to remove cropland here. This was a 57-acre field where we added some wetlands in amongst the meadows, a series of hedgerows to connect different portions of the property to each other. This has been really good for the deer hunters that hunt on the property. Loads of grassland birds and wildflowers on this particular property here. Quail have not shown up, unfortunately, at this point. This is at Tuckahoe State Park. This is what some of the grasses look like in the winter. So this nice orangey color habitat. you got a grassland or the wetland, and then across the field is a farmland that has been harvested. So it's shows the difference between sort of what standing vegetation is between 2 and 4 feet tall. So wildlife can find cover in that compared to just a harvested crop field. In many cases, the first couple years just explode with black-eyed Susans and partridge pea and lance leaf coreopsis. So they often look very yellow. And then after a couple of years, the perennials really start to come on. And so purple coneflower, the goldenrods, the asters, different species of Monarda really start to kind of increase the diversity and fill in as well. So just thinking about brood habitat, which is that habitat that is pretty open underneath, but has a canopy of cover over top. As you might imagine, if we kind of separated out these wildflowers here, particularly the partridge pea, they're single stems and have very little on the ground. So quail can move through and underneath this vegetation, basically without being detected from the air. Here's a shot of what habitat looks like in the winter after a couple years old. Lots of wildflowers. The grasses are in the kind of the light straw color and a little bit of that orange color, but there's plenty of wildflowers mixed in between, which is important from a seed source and also insects. This is what it looks like in the summertime. If you remember back last summer, that haze of the wildflower fires up north. But we're looking at diverse plantings. These generally start off really diverse with wildflowers because of the rates and the seed mixes we're using. And then we do have native grasses mixed in, and those grasses will eventually take up more of the proportion of what the field looks like over time. But we just don't want to start off with too many grasses. We've mentioned a lot about nesting habitat and brood cover, and just want to make sure that everyone is reminded that the winter cover is really important. So what you're seeing here in the foreground is northern bayberry. That's maybe 5 years old, planted in Shrub Island. This is at Sassafras Natural Resource Management Area. And so behind me is a large grassland. And then in the front there is a young tree planting that will be quail habitat for another 10 or so years. But you can see grasses, wildflowers, and that shrub, scrub, or hedgerow shrub islands. So kind of meeting all the needs grassland birds and quail will need. Same thing here. Young pine trees can provide really good cover in the winter if they're kind of concentrated, and then as they grow taller, they can be hinged cut to kind of provide more horizontal cover. But in the meantime, quail can take refuge underneath those pine trees, and there's a nice mix of wildflowers and grasses there. And this is a really scenic summertime shot of a 30-acre field in Queen Anne's County. So what we're doing is really, our efforts are really focused on quail and supporting, you know, this species, but it has so many implications for so many other wildlife that are also showing declines. And we found that quail can really make people or motivate people to make some changes on their properties compared to, say, a grasshopper sparrow. So equally important from an wildlife point of view, but not something that's going to make too many changes on some of the properties. And so I'll end on a relatively positive note compared to some of our survey data from the breeding bird survey showing these huge declines. This is another data set. This is from eBird, which is run out of Cornell. It's a community science project where birders can submit their bird sightings. All these individual pins from 2009 to 2005 to 2009 are quail sightings. So most likely males calling in the summer, a birder notes it, puts it into eBird, and it's publicly accessible data. Fast forward 5 years from 2010 to 2014. So this is the bulk of the Eastern Shore of Maryland, minus some of the lower shore. And you kind of see what's going on here. So Delaware and the Bay on the upper north east side of the map. If you compare the 2-year time time periods, numbers are increasing there. Where on the lower right, southeast portion of the image, that's Worcester County, quite a decline of individual birds sighted there. And then on the southwest portion of the image, on at least not on the western shore, but still on the eastern shore, that's area Blackwater, where you can kind of see some more pins are starting to show up in those areas. That's kind of repeated from 2015 to 2019. More individuals are seen in Delaware, and that's through a huge effort from the state of Delaware, managing thousands of acres of habitat, and it's paying dividends as number of quail are increasing dramatically over there. We're losing birds in Worcester County still, but there is some continued increase in Blackwater area. And then this is the current imagery. The orange ones are current sightings. Blue are basically sightings from that time period. And it's just kind of replicating what we're seeing from the last kind of 10 years. So where habitat is being managed, quail can do well. Areas where management stops or habitat is destroyed, those birds are declining on the landscape, and that's really what's happening in Worcester County there, compared to some of these other areas where management has persisted or increased, and birds are doing relatively well there. So happy to end on that upper note, where making a difference on either public lands or if you have the ability on private lands can make a difference for quail. And so the idea is we just need to start connecting these properties to each other so birds can start moving across the landscape. And I see that there's a few questions here. I think I'll stop sharing my screen. Do you think?
Yeah, well, thank you, Dan. Appreciate it. Thanks for sharing. I've been busy typing away, answering questions in the
Oh,
chat.
cool.
That's from ones I know, and I'm saving some for you.
Okay.
So, Sean, I'm going to hit enter on this one just to get it over to you. But let's start at the top. Brenda asked some kind of practical questions about how to work with farm agencies. Seems like some may be paying farmers to remove fence rows and hedgerows. Why can't we, get a little more collaborative efforts? It seems like sometimes do you see that there are programs that kind of work against each other in some of these situations versus all together? And do you have any ideas for how to get everybody aligned?
As you might imagine, that's a very complicated answer, and I certainly don't have all the answers to it. There are incredible opportunities for landowners and farmers, particularly through the Farm Bill program. So the Conservation Reserve program here in Maryland, we could take advantage because we're located by the Chesapeake Bay, the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, and a whole other suite of things that are available to landowners to implement or help manage their properties. Having said that, if a landowner would like to remove a hedgerow, there's not really any mechanism to stop them. So I think a lot of what we have to focus on is more of the education side of things, of the value of that habitat. It may look very messy. It's got briars and rose bushes and all these other things that, from a farmer's point of view that likes clean, simple monocultures, it's going to look messy. So a lot of what we have to focus on is sort of educating people the value of these kinds of habitats. So that's a really simple answer, but ultimately, if a landowner wants to make changes on their property, there's not a lot we can do. So I think it comes down to education.
Absolutely. Yeah. Those, I've even been out with, ecologically minded folks on meadows, and they've pointed out briars and think, oh, we got to get rid of all these thorns and messy blackberry patches. And I was like, oh no, I want to keep those. So, it's a lot of it's just, getting the word out and educating people for sure.
Yeah.
So, Dan, Sean McCandless, hey Sean, he asked, do you have any insights on the latest breed birding atlas that's just completing? Do you expect to see any declines or maybe some increases? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Hey, Sean, good question. I have to upload the latest breeding bird survey data for that chart. But for the breeding bird atlas, I would expect it's really hard to answer because there's been an amazing increase in effort in the last 5 years, I would say, of multiple organizations and agencies and people really focused on quail, adding habitat to the landscape that hadn't been there previously. Luke is, for example, is one. We have quail biologists working with NRCS now. Quail Forever chapter is here in Maryland. There's just a lot more interest for quail and grassland birds. Whether birders were able to access some of those properties to detect these breeding quail for the breeding bird atlas, or if the habitat improvements and management were implemented early enough where quail could actually show up and then be detected, I don't really know. It's really, really hard to say, to be honest with you. I, I I don't know. I guess is the question, the answer really, because it's going to vary from one portion of the state to the other, I guess.
Yeah. Brenda asked a couple of questions. I'm going to try and combine these together. One is, do you have to manage frag in some of these new meadows and wetlands? I saw you were right on the water's edge. How do you do that? And then also she asked, is Maryland doing any cooperative habitat plans for various types of animals, not just quail? And that's also a pretty complicated answer, but I'll let you try and take a crack at it. So first is Phragmites.
Frag, yeah. Frag's interesting. Obviously, we know it's an invasive and forms monocultures and pushes out all of our native marsh habitat, species, and then also sees decline in birds as well. Um, on the on the drier side of where frag is, if it is near quail habitat, if quail are in the area, they can actually utilize that a marsh edge, probably more so than what would maybe be native marsh, depending on the makeup of those species. They can certainly dive into it for some cover if they're getting chased. So in general, if you did see some frag out on some of those images, and we have some small areas within our grassland habitat that we do kind of try and manage, and that is spot treatment with some herbicide. We're not necessarily managing or really not really advising landowners on river edges if to manage frag, to be honest with you. And then
Cooperative habitat plans for any animals, not just quail.
I think there is, yes. There's a lot of work out in Western Maryland, I think, focused on woodcock habitat, golden wing warbler habitat. So these species that are also showing declines. There's NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service programs geared towards not just quail, but other grassland birds and specific plantings for them. So meadowlarks, dickcissels, grasshopper sparrows. And keep in mind, those are really important habitat types that lots of other species are going to benefit. So I don't know, Luke, do you know of other cooperatives that are focused on other species?
Yeah, I think there's also, there's folks, a lot of nonprofits, NGOs. We have now people from Tall Timbers who work on the Delmarva. Kyle Magic is out here. So I'd say getting plugged into the sort of conservation community. And I think NRCS is an easy one because they're local. They might be able to tell you about other land trusts or others who might have some educational and efforts or even habitat planning tools available. So I'd say there's a whole nonprofit side. There's the Maryland, the state level, you get the federal level, and then university systems. So there's a diverse kind of array of places to go, I guess I would say.
Yeah, I was thinking about it from a other species
Yeah.
point of view, but yeah, the number of organizations focus on wildlife has increased dramatically over the last several years here in Maryland.
Here's a good one from Trevor Lewis. He works a lot with Quail Forever. I think he found our local chapter. Welcome, Trevor. Good to see you. He says, I wonder about the optimal mix between shrubs and grasses. Seems like there's a tradition of having more grasses than shrubs. Um, how are you guys? Are you testing any of that? He says he finds the quail he finds in the wild are almost always in near shrubby growth. And I know you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, so it's a little bit seasonally dependent, right? So come fall, and I'll use the 200-acre grassland on the River and Field campus as an example. During the summertime, birds, both male and female, are spread throughout those grasses. So they're focused on nesting, right? As the fall approaches, vegetation starts to die back, things become a little bit more exposed. They naturally gravitate in these coveys to areas that are, within a couple 100 feet of that woody cover. So cedar trees, the bayberry thickets, the briars and things like that they know are there, they can fly to escape predators and seek refuge if there's snow on the ground. So during the winter months, they're definitely going to be focused over those areas. There's a concept that Tall Timbers put out, or this kind of a simplified version of what habitat could look like, called the rule of thirds, where you want to do, a third forbs and bare ground, third grasses, and a third shrubby woody cover. That's probably a decent way to kind of think about the landscape. But I think you could see from our chart, for example, the breeding success has been really high on the River and Field campus because of those open grasslands. But our winter survivorship is down. So we need to increase woody cover. So I guess using the thirds is probably a decent way of thinking about it.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Dan. I think that answers it well.
You're welcome.
Yeah. I think that's all the official questions, but I had a few things to highlight that I think are important for people to know or think about. One I always like to get at is mowing and timing of mowing and what kind of mowing. Like if people are mowing to try and manage these grasslands, what do you say? What do you recommend?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you're going to do mowing, which is probably the most readily accessible way to kind of manipulate the vegetation that most farmers, landowners have, you want to focus that mowing sort of right around April 1st. Give it a few days on either side of April 1st and come up with a mow plan where you're leaving at least 50% of the habitat up from one year to the next after your mow. So it could be in a patchwork, it could be in strips, but the main point is do not mow in the beginning part of the winter and do not mow it all at once. You will just it will be too dramatic of a change for wildlife out there. Even if you don't have quail, think about the rabbits and things like that are using it. Ideally, mowing too frequently, say if you have really thick grasses, it creates a larger thatch layer that the wildflowers can't come up through. And then also, if you've got quail there, really can't walk through. Think about a young chick with inch-long legs trying to move through thatch that could be, 6 or 8 inches deep. So mowing of wildflowers and some of the woody cover it has less dramatic negative effects than just mowing the grasses. Ideally, what you're doing is combining and some of the mowing with some other form of management, and that could be light disking to kind of break up some of those grasses and create some more bare ground. Or if you have the ability, which unfortunately is pretty limited at the moment here in Maryland, is to try and get prescribed fire on the grasses to kind of thin that thatch out. Though unfortunately, it's not very readily available to most people at the moment.
Great. Another one as well is you mentioned herbicide, and I know some of our guests might. I know when you get started with these in ecology and you want to do the right thing, you might kind of think like, I don't really want to be poisoning, but putting poison out on the landscape. Can we talk a little bit about the role of herbicide, how to do it safely, whether it's effective, and just sort of talk a little bit about that from an ecological perspective when people might have sort of a knee-jerk reaction against wanting to put herbicide on the ground?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I will, if you want just to start off thinking about if you go from a farm field that's getting broadcast boom sprayed multiple times a year to a transition part of that farm into native habitat, it will require some herbicide to maintain it in the state of early successional habitat that you are shooting for. So while it's hard to eliminate the use of herbicide in some of these, you're reducing the amount you're using dramatically. The other thing is you're going to be you're highly specific at what you're trying to manage with herbicide. So you're no longer blanket spraying, but you're spot treating specific things. And I'm mostly thinking about woody vegetation. So here in Maryland, with our climate being relatively in most years relatively wet, trees are going to want to invade these fields. And so herbicide to kind of halt that invasion is critical. In certain areas, depending on where you live, a major problem is calorie pear or Bradford pear encroaching in some of these fields. And so mowing does not do anything to stop the invasion of some of these trees. And so treating them when they're young, highly targeted, it works well at a certain time of year. So herbicide is an important component of it, but it's important to note that the amount that you're using and the chemicals you're using are definitely much less than on a regular farm.
Great. Somebody jumped in, several thank yous, and also some, I didn't mention earlier, some people were really complimenting you on the 2,000 plus acres of work y'all have already done. So you got some thumbs ups and liked for that.
Thank you.
Teresa asked, what would be the minimum acreage or area needed to start transitioning farmland?
That's a great question. And it's a hard answer because it really depends on the landscape context. So say you have a 20-acre farm field and it's 100% surrounded by woods with a narrow driveway going to it. You could make a difference for some grassland birds, or probably more shrubland birds and pollinators in that aspect. But it's kind of like a fishbowl, right? So there's a lot of predator pressure, not to mention seed pressure from trees. Whereas if you kind of do the opposite, you have this massive open farmland and you put 20 acres of meadow habitat right in the middle of that. During the growing season, soybean and young corn do facilitate movement of, in this case, quail. So if there are areas of habitat nearby that quail are already using, they will find that 20 acres and you can make a big difference. So the context of the property and the area is important, in addition to what are your neighbors doing? Are there hedgerows in the area that can help facilitate movement? So there's those things. I would say at a minimum, you would probably want to start with 20 acres if you really are focused on quail. If you're focused on pollinators, for example, you can definitely put in a lot less and make a huge difference for them. So it depends on your target, but for quail, I would say 20, and it could be 5 acres across 4 different properties that are kind of next to each other. So it doesn't all have to be on one property.
Awesome, Dan. Getting some more congratulations. Thanks, Wayne. And I'll just close with one last question. We're at 101, but I think I'd love to hear about your thoughts on maintenance, the most practical ways to do maintenance on these. How frequently are you burning? What do you think? Is there a spectrum of kind of lowest level maintenance that you need versus sort of the premium approach? And how would you maybe describe that? Or do you need to go because it's 1 o'clock?
I got one more. I can answer that question. I'm just going to do the lab that I'm in is some of the professor and some of the students are starting to come in. So I'll answer relatively quickly. Sorry about that. It all depends on what your objectives are. So if you have a field that is heavy in grass, growth, maybe the taller grasses, the big blue stem switchgrass that were really prevalent in the late 90s, early 2000s when some of these CRP fields were going in, like we have on the River and Field campus. We're burning on a 2-year rotation there because the thatch, the biomass growth each year is really intense compared to these newer plantings where you have the shorter stature grasses at a lower rate, like little blue stem, purple top, and some of these other grasses that are much less aggressive. So fire is a critical, important thing for managing habitat, but the frequency is going to vary depending on the habitat itself. But in lieu of fire, strip disking, so creating shallow discs through a farm field after sort of a mow can really help stimulate the seed bank again, and provide that kind of brood early, that like those really early successional species that come up in that recently disturbed ground and next to some of the other grasses that are going to be your nesting habitat. And then, but you wouldn't want to do that too much because you're going to shift the balance towards these annuals and not necessarily your perennials. And then herbicide is sort of needed as is. So if you see trees encroaching, you see state listed noxious weeds like Canada thistle, Johnson grass, you're going to be applying that probably more on an annual basis. So it really varies on sort of your target, how your habitat is, when it was planted, and what stage it is. But I don't think you want to burn more than every other year. If you have the ability to add fire to your management regime, that's great, but it's not something that you have to have all the time.
Great. Hey, Dan, thanks so much. Appreciate it. We're getting a lot of thank yous on the chat, and thank you all for joining as well. It makes a difference. Please do share this webinar with your friends. Other people are interested in this. I will pop the links in below. I will let Dan jump off, and for people who might want to keep in touch more, I'm going to put all that stuff in there. Feel free to subscribe. It helps. The more we get this out on our YouTube, more people subscribe, more people jump on, and help spread the word. So please do that. And thank you all for joining. Thank you, Dan, again. And we look forward to talking to everybody in January.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining, and thanks Luke for organizing it. These series are fantastic. Really appreciate it to be a part of it.
Awesome.